Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Data Protection Frequently Asked Questions webinar. I can see we have 7 people in the chat. Contrary to what's appearing as the little symbol and next to my name, I'm not Bernd Stahl. That's just who owns the account. My name is William Knight. I'm a research fellow and the compliance manager for the project. And I'm joined by Simi Akintoye, who's just here next to me, who's the data protection officer for the Human Brain Project. We decided to hold this webinar because we understand that there are obviously questions about data protection, which really need to be addressed. And we wanted to structure it in a way that was sort of pointing towards questions that we know come up often, rather than giving you the basic information that you probably encountered quite a lot, but trying to find those questions which are perhaps lesser answered and perhaps more difficult to answer, but also give you, because I know that a lot of people in the chat will be ethics rapporteurs, the option and the chance to ask us questions to try to address anything that might emerge in your one-pagers. So the idea is that we're going to address some frequently asked questions. We're going to give you some resources which you can refer to, both internal within the Human Brain Project and outside of the Human Brain Project, to try to give you some references to refer to. We're going to have 2 presentations, 15 minutes from Simi and 15 minutes from myself. And then after that, there'll be half an hour where you guys can have the opportunity to ask questions and hopefully get some answers that you're looking for. So Simi's going to start by covering some of the frequently asked questions, and then I'll give you some links and some different references that you can refer to. So please feel free to think about questions you want to ask them in the questions section, and we'll see if we can address them at the end. Okay, let's see how we can make this full screen, and then Simi can get going. Okay. Yeah. Is it the blank screen? Okay, Simi, do you want to just start and we'll go from there. If there's any problems, technical difficulties, please let us know. From our end, it's looking okay, but we obviously can't see what you see. So take it away.
So good morning, everyone. My name is Simi Akintoye, and I'm the Data Protection Officer for the Human Brain Project. Quickly, I'm going to just tell you what I do within SB 12, Ethics and Society. My role includes legal and ethical compliance with applicable laws, particularly the General Data Protection Regulation, which is the applicable data protection law for Europe. And the whole idea is to ensure that the project as a whole, the HBP, is as compliant as it can be with applicable legislation. I work with the compliance team here at DMU, looking at how we can maintain best practices in terms of legal and ethical compliance. So I'm going to go through some frequently asked questions, and I'm going to just take you through to what these means in terms of the law. As Will said, he would be letting you understand in more detail how this is applied in the HBP. So just to take you through what I'm going to be looking at today, what is legal compliance, followed by what is ethical compliance, what is personal data, what is sensitive data, what does the law say about anonymization, and can data be truly anonymized in the sense that the GDPR anticipates? And then finally, we're going to touch upon whether or not each of you within your SPs are data controllers, or what does that mean for the HBP? So what is legal compliance? One of the things that you should be aware of in terms of legal compliance is the General Data Protection Regulation. That is the major legislation that covers the whole of Europe, that looks at the law in terms of compliance with privacy and data protection. So privacy in itself covers a lot of things, including data protection. It is one of the fundamental human rights that have been enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the European Convention of Human Rights. So privacy is really very broad in that sense. There is a human rights resonance with privacy. Data protection, on the other hand, really relates to personal data. So your own personal data identity, what does this mean for you? So legal compliance generally, in terms of the general data protection regulation, applies to processing of personal data. That is what we want to be associated with. And personal data in itself is any information that relates to an identified or identifiable person. So we're looking at anybody that can identify a natural person using all means reasonably likely to be used. So in terms of personal data, there are two categories. It can either be personal data under Article 6, names, telephone numbers, email addresses, and the likes. It can also be special category personal data. So we're looking at racial origin, ethnical origin, religious opinions. It could be anything in terms of genetic data that would require even more layered level of protection, because it's not just personal, it is really special category, it is sensitive, biometric data, something that uniquely identifies a natural person. So there is essentially a difference between personal data, the general data, your email address, your IP address, your name, your telephone number, or the sensitive data that has to do with your religious beliefs, political beliefs, genetic data. These would also require extra level of protection. So ethical compliance, on the other hand, I'm going to discuss it just based on what we do in the HBP. There's a lot of ethical challenges. We all know the kind of research that goes on in the Human Brain Project. So apart from complying with the law in terms of personal data and sensitive data is really broad and gives us, even from the broader perspective, it narrows down to specific things that we all have to do in terms of getting consent, making sure we have appropriate legal basis for processing personal and sensitive data. Ethical compliance, on the other hand, is not enshrined in the General Data Protection Regulation. So there isn't a law that says this is ethics, this is how you comply with it. Within the HBP, we look at a lot of ethical challenges in ethics and society. This could be in terms of research ethics, bioethics, medical ethics, animal protection, human subject research, treatment of patients. There could also be issues around dual use of the data, technology, ethics. There are some risks that this would present. How do we comply with it? How do we make sure that data that we get from non-EU GDPR countries are really ethical, and how do we make sure that that is something we can use in the HBP? The question of ethical compliance is one that cannot be fully answered. There isn't a straightforward answer. Ethics is very personal to people, and it's quite interesting to see that researchers are thinking about this in the HBP. We do a lot of dissemination events. We've written papers on ethical compliance that we can signpost people to make us all aware of how we can be ethical in terms of making sure that the research that we do in the HBP complies with best practices. So ethics would start with a notion of best practices. What is ethical to you? How do you ensure that this is something that you anticipate within your research? And there is responsible research and innovation that looks at aligning the process and the outcomes of your research to the needs and expectations of the society. So there is an arm in SB12 that deals with, RRI and helps to engage stakeholders, including public, to ensure that the research that the Human Brain Project does is really ethical. So ethical compliance in that sense is making sure that we're aware of the implications of the research that we do, and we anticipate this, we enshrine this from the beginning to the end, and we sort of answer questions that the public would want us to answer within the ambit of our research. One good way to do that is, working with the stakeholders from the beginning and making sure that that is something that we cover. So that essentially is ethical compliance within HBP. How do we balance this? So legal and ethical issues, how does this come to terms in the HBP? It's really difficult to put a fine line between privacy and innovation. Whilst the HBP is trying to break new grounds, is trying to be the forefront of research, being at the beginning or at the very beginning of research in terms of innovation and strategic innovation for Europe, looking at the research infrastructure of e-brains, which is the ultimate goal of HBP. It is very important as researchers to identify the conflicts that privacy and innovation might posit. So balancing data protection and privacy with data utility, the research and innovation that we want to attain is something that we always have to think at the back of our mind. What would be the implications of this research? So for research organizations such as the HBP, the GDPR aims to create a supportive framework to facilitate exchange and processing of data using safeguards to ensure that personal information can be used appropriately while protecting personal rights to privacy and enhancing public trust. So finding that balance is what we constantly try to achieve within the HBP. So quickly, we're going to move to anonymization. That is a very interesting thing to look at. Because the GDPR is very, very detailed about, personal data, sensitive data, as we looked at before, the GDPR does not apply to anonymized information. So any information that cannot identify a natural person, does not make you identifiable, is not within the ambit of the GDPR. So because it's no longer personal data, then that means that data can be effectively processed without conflicting with legal laws or ethical laws, as it were. So that is the whole idea about anonymization. The GDPR doesn't apply to anonymized information. But what is anonymized information? This is information that doesn't in any way relate to identified or identifiable natural persons. So this is information that can never be traced to the person. It has been de-identified. It makes that data subject no longer identifiable. So you've done everything regarding it. There is some guidelines that has been broadly defined in the GDPR regarding how to anonymize data. Question is, can data be truly anonymized? So the data that you use within your SPs, the data that you get presented with as rapporteurs, can you fully say that this is anonymized data, is no longer within the GDPR? Yes, we can use it for research. And can you really use, anonymized data for research? That is something, that you'd want to think about. And one of the things that I'd like to say is regarding Article 29 Working Party Opinion that talks about anonymization techniques. So it gives us 3 criteria. And it says, if you can do these 3 things, then your data is perfectly okay. You can use it for the purposes of your research because it's no longer within GDPR. So is it still possible to singular within that data? Is it still possible to link records relating to an individual, and can information be inferred concerning that individual? So if you go through it, it tells you more detail how you can, really look at whether this data has been anonymized or not. If you're able to do these 3 things, if you can still identify the individual, you can still link records, you can still infer either from, numbers, from binary numbers or whatever codes you've generated, then that means that this data is not anonymized, hence it falls within GDPR. So it's really difficult to fully say that you're anonymized. It talks about the ICO guidance gives you some penetration tests that you can do to actually see whether this data is anonymized, and if it falls short, then it is not anonymized. It is the next thing down, which is pseudonymized, and then you need to comply with GDPR. So pseudonymization, which is the next thing underneath, is where you cannot, you're not able to fully anonymize it, but you've done the best thing you can. So you've processed the data in such a way that the data can no longer be attributed to a specific subject without the use of additional information. So it is about keeping that additional information separate, making sure that you've got technical and organizational measures in place to ensure that this new data that you've got, whatever you've got, is not linked to the original data that would otherwise identify that person. So unlike anonymization, pseudonymization's techniques will not exempt you from GDPR. It just helps you meet your data protection obligations. So if you're not able to anonymize it, but you've prevented direct identification, as is not possible, then you've done the best thing, which is pseudonymizing that data. You will still need to protect it, but that data then falls under GDPR. So it's quite interesting understanding, because a lot of people would say we're not within GDPR, and we've anonymized our data, but in effect, what they've done is pseudonymization. So you using the word anonymization doesn't just mean that you've anonymized it. It's about looking at what you've done and how that means in terms of GDPR. Finally, the last thing I'd like to talk about is, are you a data controller? This is a very interesting issue, and this is something that the HBP is currently looking at within the aspect of, the HBP itself as a whole, and also in future the e-brains. But I would like everyone to begin to think about whether what they do within their SPs, either as rapporteurs or as researchers, are you effectively a data controller? The fact that you think you're not, or you feel you don't control data within the GDPR doesn't mean that you're not. So the law would not overlook the fact that you haven't, you say you're not a data controller. It is about what you do and how that pans out. So Article 4 effectively defines what a data controller is. It's a natural or legal person, don't have to be an entity. It could be a public authority or body that either by themselves or jointly with others, they determine the purposes and means of processing personal data. And it goes on and on. But the whole idea is understanding that if you either personally or with other people within your SPs, in your sub-project, you determine what the purposes and means of personal data is. And it gives you the explanation of what is purpose, what is means, how do you determine, and all of that. But the entity or the person that decides the what and the how of processing would be the controller. An entity doesn't have to have access to personal data to be a controller, even if the personal data doesn't physically reside with you. Like we know in the HBP, a lot of the research institutions and bodies that process this data, does this research, they have the personal data directly linked to them. We may not have access to it, but it is enough if you determine the purpose and means, if you have influence on that processing, if you cause the processing of data, personal data to start, you can start the process, you can stop the process. And the most important thing is, even if you receive anonymous statistics based on personal data that has been collected by another entity, you receive a statistic that is anonymous, doesn't mean you're dealing with anonymized data. As long as you process that statistics, then you can be deemed to be a controller or joint controller within that. And the HBP is currently trying to ascertain the status with regards to each sub-project. Are we controllers, are we joint controllers, and are we processors? And you may not be the overall controller or joint controller. It might just be within a particular scope or what you do in terms of the role and responsibilities. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to hand over to my colleague Will, who will then give us even more practicalities on how this pans out in the HBP. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Simi. So there's quite a lot of information there. I'm just going to quickly switch over from Simi's presentation to mine. So what Simi's done, obviously, is give us a lot of information about the various different regulations and laws which concern data protection. But obviously, we've tackled a lot of these questions in a lot of the stuff that we've produced, particularly within sub-project 12 and perhaps even more specifically within ethics support, which is work package 12.4, which is where myself and Simi are sort of structured within the project. So Simi's given you an idea of some of the sort of frequently asked questions and how they are reflected in law. What I'm going to do in my presentation is point you towards some of the resources that we've produced here in ethics support, and also within the role that we play in the Data Governance Working Group and within Subproject 12, Ethics and Society in a wider sense, to attempt to try to answer some of these questions. And in particular, sort of addressing the question of where can I find answers to my questions? Now, an answer to that question could be, I'll email Will or I'll email Simi, and they can answer the question. And that's a perfectly reasonable way to go about answering those questions. But we're academics often, we're researchers, we're scientists, we want to be able to reference and we want to be able to find the actual resources that we can point someone to and say, this is where I got this answer from, rather than just saying, someone told me. So what I'm going to do is go through some of the documentation and hopefully give you an idea of where you can find extra information if you want to find it. But as I say, it's perfectly reasonable to email hpb.compliance@dmu.ac.uk or Simi directly as a data protection officer for answers to some of these questions. So your main resource for sort of answers to data policy questions is likely to be the Data Policy Manual. Now, this is the Data Policy Manual is quite a large document. It was originally developed in SGA1 as a sort of an appendix to an original deliverable, and it has grown since then. And in month 1 of SGA2, we submitted it as the first initial sort of draft to the European Commission for their approval. It's gone through a number of different versions. It's produced in collaboration with Ethics Support, SP12, the Data Governance Working Group, and the Ethics Advisory Board. And as you can see, there's a lot of different people listed in there as contributors. And the idea of the Data Policy Manual is that it's the primary sort of overview of the primary data protection concerns associated with research and work in the Human Brain Project, and then of course the applicable laws and regulations which apply to those concerns. We're currently on version 1.1, dated the 5th of November, which is of this year, and that version actually includes very recent updates which went in response to some of the requests from the European Commission from the latest ethics review over the summer. You can find the Data Policy Manual, and I had meant to put a link in the chat, so I can do that once I've finished talking. But you'll find it at these links listed underneath the text here, which is the Data Governance webpage on the HPP website, or the Data Protection webpage on the HPP website, and they both include the most up-to-date version of this document, which includes, as I say, all the latest updates that we've made in response to the EC requests. So there's two main parts, the two large, in general, parts of the Data Policy Manual. So in part 1, it looks at the data protection guidance and policy in the Human Brain Project. This section is very much focused on HPP research and how the GDPR is implemented in Human Brain Project research. So it's very relevant to those of you who are conducting research within the Human Brain Project, which is collecting data from human beings, effectively. So there's certain sections of here which may be more or less relevant to the kind of work you're doing, but all of it will be relevant to you somewhere, because even if you're not collecting data for research purposes, you may well be, you are definitely contributing and collecting data, for example, like staff data about the people you work with, email addresses, and you do still have responsibilities to that data, but that's responsibilities that we all have. So perhaps the most important part is how that applies to HPP research. And of course, a lot of this is about the implementation of GDPR, which is really the big elephant in the room. The second section focuses on data contribution and model organism data, that is to say, non-human animal data. And this focuses on how data are registered in HPP platforms and what standards those data must reach. Clearly, as the infrastructures are changing quite recently, this is a section which is going to be reviewed and perhaps updated quite recently, and may even be superseded by other pieces of documentation we're producing. The DPM is a live document. It's not something that we have written and will stay static forever. It's something that needs to be updated regularly as regulations change, but also as the project changes and our responsibilities change along with it. So the DPM, you will hopefully see that changes over time and has different elements changing as laws change and as the project changes. So I'm not going to. I have maybe 8 minutes left, so I'm not going to read the DPM out to you because we'll be here all day. It's 70+ pages long. There's a lot of information in there. Some of it is quite dense. So what I'm hopefully going to do is go through the larger sections, detail what sort of content is in those sections. I'm not going to go through it. I'm not going to sort of explain it to you, but I'm going to point you in the direction. If you have a particular question, I'm going to hopefully point you in the direction of the answer to that question. So The early part of the DPM is concerned with the sort of broad approach that the Human Brain Project takes to the implementation of GDPR. So sections 3.1, 2, and 3.3, and then sort of 3.4 and 5 are looking at the how and the philosophy and the method of applying GDPR in the Human Brain Project. So if you need to know that kind of stuff, if that's something that you want to include in, say, the one pages that you're going to be writing, that these sections will be where you want to look. Section 3.4 is perhaps a very, very useful section, because what this does is it gives a very in-depth definition of personal data and sensitive personal data, as Simi has covered in her presentation. Which, again, if you're collecting such data, if you're collecting data from human beings, it's quite important that you have a good working knowledge of those definitions. Additionally, it's quite important that you understand what data isn't regulated by GDPR. Simi obviously talked about anonymized data, but also there's a lot of other derogations. Animal data, for example, isn't covered by GDPR. Data about deceased persons isn't regulated by GDPR. So there's a list in there of those particular exemptions. So again, it's worth, if you're collecting any type of data, just being sure that you don't have to comply with GDPR by referring to section 3.4 of the Data Policy Manual, to make sure that you're aware of that. So section 3.5 covers the definitions of data controllers and data processors. Simi has said already that this is this is sort of an ongoing conversation about who is and who isn't a data controller, what responsibilities HBB partners have in sort of contrast to perhaps the legal entity and other elements, and whether there is joint controllership. These are ongoing debates, but the Data Policy Manual does include substantive information about what responsibilities each of the data controller would have or a data processor would have. So if you need to know that information, you need to look in section 3.5, pages 17 to 19. Section 3.6 looks at the management of data-related risks. So this is a new section. This is what came in with the latest ethics review. And this section details the project level risk management, which is things like the risk register, which has a couple of data-related risks associated with it, which are updated and monitored regularly. The responsibilities of partners with regards to task and SP level risks. So the work that I do with regards to compliance management, for example, is a way that we manage the risk of data at a task and SP level. And then, of course, the individual partner level risks and responsibilities. It's important that you understand that every partner in the Human Brain Project understands that everybody has a responsibility with regards to data, and a legal responsibility often lies with the partners for the data that they manage. So understand it's important you understand the responsibilities that lie there. So that's where you need to look for that kind of information. Section 3.8 looks at data quality. So these are ideas of how you can process data, what purposes for collection, the concepts of minimization and storage limitations, and ideas of when you need to delete data, as well as the qualities of data such as accuracy, integrity, confidentiality, and accountability. These are, if you're collecting any data, particularly, as we say, human data and personal data, these are the ideas these are the concepts that you will need to understand, and these are fairly well understood, but they're set out here, and if you need to reference it, then this is where you need to look. Sorry, losing my voice a little bit. Section 3.9 through to 3.11 looks at the legal basis for processing data. Within the Human Brain Project, if you're collecting data from humans, often that will be consent. So the requirements with regards to informed consent are included in the Data Policy Manual. So that's included in this section. But it also looks at the idea of, because GDPR, of course, applies to all data, but there are derogations and exemptions for scientific research. And it's perhaps worth you familiarizing yourself with these ideas, and they are included in pages 30 to 37 of the Data Policy Manual. So if you're interested in those kind of things, that will be where you need to look. A quite short and sweet section, but I think a quite useful one, will be how the laws differ in different certain countries. GDPR applies across the EU, and for a number of other countries who have data protection adequacy and things like that. But it is still implemented slightly differently, or is modified in different jurisdictions. So it may be worth you just checking this table. It's quite a clear table to check whether there are any differences in between the way that you handle personal data within different countries. So this could be quite a useful reference for you to familiarize yourself with how it works in your particular country. Section 3.31 is perhaps very useful for anyone collecting data and building systems which collect data, and building programs or software or hardware which collects data, because this is about design, data protection by design and default, which is a design concept which looks to build data protection into a system from its very early days. And it's not relevant to everyone, but it is something that if you're building a system which collects data, you may need to familiarize yourself with. 3.14 is perhaps the most important section if you are collecting personal data. This is about individual data subject rights, because these are the rights that your participants in your research have to the personal data that you're collecting. And these are quite important to ensure that you can give your participants access to these rights, because if you don't, then you're potentially in breach of GDPR. I'm not going to list them all here, but as I say, they are listed in the data policy manual, and they're worth referring to, because although I imagine a lot of them you understand them, it's worth having a working definition of them and understanding how they work. Required documentation of GDPR. Some of this will be relevant, but I think a lot of this is handled by the data protection processes at your institution. So data protection officers at the institution, for example, will often have the required documentation of the GDPR, but it may be something that you want to look at. Section 3.17, I hope, is something that we don't ever have to refer to, but it is the idea of what we do in the event of a data breach. So if some personal data that you've collected is shared beyond the means that you collected it for, or it's lost, or you find there's been some leakage of data, then this section here from page 47 to 50 gives you the information you need about how you could handle that particular institution. I mean, I think in the first instance, I would send an email with the exclamation mark ticked to one of us here in ethics support to make sure that we're all aware of the situation. But familiarize yourself with that particular section, because just in case this kind of thing happens, but I'm entirely sure that it won't. Section 4 of the data policy manual has advice about anonymization. As Simi said, that is it's a relatively controversial subject and perhaps difficult to achieve under GDPR. But if you want to know more about it, there is information on the ethics resources and ethics support website on the Human Brain Project website, but also it's included in the data policy manual in section 4. And finally, for part 1, there is information in there about the requirements for international data transfer. So if you have personal information that you've collected about people within the European Union, and you want to transfer that personal data unanonymized to a collaborator or a partner outside of the European Union, there are requirements and restrictions on that data that you must be sure that you comply with. This must be dealt with at the partner level. You have to ensure that you see that is implemented appropriately. So if you're interested in that, if that's the kind of thing that is happening at the partner level, make sure you're familiar with the requirements for international data transfers, because this is the kind of stuff that the European Commission are very, very interested in. They are absolutely want to make sure that there is no personal data leaving the European Union without it adhering to GDPR requirements. Okay, so so that's section 1. That's the bulk of the data policy manual. It's very focused on research. It's very focused on the Human Brain Project, and it's important that you understand that many of these elements, many of these ideas, must be implemented by partners. We here in ethics support and in the data governance working group and other elements of the sort of organizational structure of the Human Brain Project can advise you and assist you. or assist partners in general, but they must be implemented at the partner level. And there are legal requirements that they're implemented at the partner level, because we can't take on those responsibilities. We can only assist you. We're more than happy to help you through that process and speak with data protection officers and organizations at the partner institutions. But again, it's important that you understand the responsibility often lies at the partner. So the second part of the data policy manual looks at data contribution and modern organism data. This primarily focuses on the requirements of data being submitted to infrastructure. Now, as you can understand, things are changing quite rapidly and changing quite frequently with regards to the eBrains infrastructure. So there are elements of this which I would consider under review. And I think a lot of it will perhaps be superseded by some of the documentation we're working on at the moment, for example, access policies to eBrain infrastructure. I think that a lot of the ideas that we cover in the data policy manual will come to be superseded by documentation we produce in SJ3 and are producing now. But there are still pieces of information in there which will be useful, particularly the stuff about model organism data, that is to say, animal data, because we talk about the ethics compliance requirements for animal data. Now, those of you who are conducting such research and are on this call will be familiar, and I don't think any of the things in the data policy manual will surprise you. It's the ideas of adhering and complying with the 3Rs principle and the directive, the ethics, the European Commission directive on the use of animals in research. So it won't surprise you, but it may well be important when you approach the writing of the one pages, to make sure that you're just using the right terminology, and the same terminology that we use in our documentation should hopefully be reflected in yours as well. So if you want to remind yourself of how that works, I would refer to this here. If you do have questions about data contribution and what standards data must reach when it is to be uploaded to infrastructure, to eBrains infrastructures, certainly drop an email to myself or Simi, or even as liaise with the data curation team in Oslo and Jülich, and try and find the information you have there. And hopefully we can try to address them. But I would say that a lot of the information in here is likely to be updated in the coming months as things change. So that's the data policy manual. It's a really big document. It can be perhaps unwieldy. So what I've hoped to do here is point you in the direction of some of the content which is going to be really useful for you. I think it's important when you come to write the one pages or other sort of ethics or data protection or data governance elements of reports that you're writing, that we are using similar language, that we're all talking from the same, we're all singing from the same hymn sheet, as the English phrase goes, to make sure that we aren't conflicting in anything. So it's not the only resource that you can use. There's a lot of documents produced by the Human Brain Project, by Ethics Support, by Ethics in Society, SP12, and the Data Governance Working Group, but also obviously the Dual Use Working Group. Sorry, I should have added that onto the end there. Data Policy Manual, as I listed there. There is a Data Policy Quick Guide, which is like a pared down, bite-sized version of the Data Policy Manual. It's still 23 pages long, so it is still quite long because there's a lot of information we have to get in there. But it is perhaps a more bite-sized information, and that's also available on the Data Governance website and the Data Protection website on the HCP, the main HCP website. There's the Compliance Management SOP if you're interested in research ethics compliance and how we manage that process. There's the non-EU animal data SOP, which is about data transfers of animal data coming from outside the European Union, but also includes broader ideas of compliance of animal data in general. So if you conduct your animal research, that's something that you want to look at. And then there's the recently produced, or rather, relatively recently produced opinion on responsible dual use, which I think is a very important document, which is hot off the press, so to speak. So, but I understand a lot of you will have attended the previous seminar on this, and certainly the Dual Use Working Group is the centre of expertise on that idea. So, if that's a concern, and I think it should be something you include in your one pages, I would refer to that. And all of these can be found on the Ethics Resources website, which is just there, which you can find in the social, ethical, and reflective section of the website. There you'll find all of the HCP standard operating procedures, and also web pages with general advice on a number of different issues, including data governance, data protection, anonymization, and ethics compliance. For a perhaps broader idea of ethics and ethics compliance, but also neuroethics and other ideas across the Human Brain Project, ethical concepts and issues across the Human Brain Project, the Ethics Dialogues blog is a blog run by SP12 and 12.4 in particular, which addresses a number of those ideas in perhaps a more digestible format, a way that hopefully can be something you can refer to as perhaps a more digestible ethics discussions. And of course, there are external resources you can refer to. The European Commission website, if you want to refer directly to the legislation, is something that you can definitely refer to. You'll obviously understand that you may have local requirements with your own data protection authority, which you should be familiar with if you have concerns. And of course, at your institution, you will likely have a data protection officer who can hopefully also help you through some of these questions. So those are the sort of the internal and external resources that I would point you towards to try to answer some questions if you have them. But we have 15-20 minutes left where myself and Simi, and we've got George Ogo here, who's also in ethics support as a data governance expert. We have other people around who can try to answer questions. So what I would like to do is open the floor up, give you the opportunity to ask any questions if you have them, and we'll try and answer them. So if I can just switch back off this site, so stop sharing there. You can see we have a few chats. Thank you, Boris. Yeah. So feel free to either use the chat or the questions. So Paige, we don't have a massive number of people here, so it's not going to get overwhelming. But if you have questions, feel free to ask them. If not, then we will finish a little bit early.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just while we're waiting for perhaps everyone to think about questions and reflect on the rather very informative discussions that we've had. I think a question has come through. So
well, you go and then we'll address Boris's
right.
question.
Okay. What I was going to say quickly is one of the things that we're working with in terms of the standard contractual clauses. One of the questions that's we've had to address was the issue of international data transfers following Brexit or a no deal or deal Brexit. It's very interesting that we look at this because you might be asked within your SPs as ethics reporters, what happens if the UK leaves the European Union, and how do we ensure onward transfer of personal data to the UK? So one of the things I would quickly say is in the UK, we are very aware of the implications that Brexit would have for data protection. If in the event that the UK leaves the European Union on the 31st of January without a deal, so a no-deal Brexit, the UK is going to become a third party. In other words, a third country. So the UK would be like any other country, like America, any country in Asia or Africa, for the purposes of data transfers. So it's no longer within the ambit of GDPR. The good thing is, even at that level, both the UK ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, and the European Data Protection Board has identified that the UK already has a lot of data protection legislations that align with the GDPR. So the transfer of personal data from every UK institution to EU would not be restricted. So exporting data from the UK to the EU would not be an issue, even at the level of a no-deal Brexit in the worst possible case scenario. So you would be allowed to still, send data from the UK to the EU for those of you who work in the UK. The problem would be the importation of data. So when data comes back to the UK, it becomes an issue because then you as the EU institution would have to have reason or appropriate measures in place to be able to send data to the UK. So just to clarify that the exportation of data from the UK to any country within Europe will not be discontinued. What would be problematic is when you want to receive data into the UK. And for the purposes of that, we are developing standard contractual clauses just to make sure that we can then do this safely without breaching any applicable laws. And this is already in place, at the level of the EPFL. It would have to mean some amendments to the consortium agreements that we currently have with all our consortium members. And that is something that we are looking at. We are in the process of finalizing that so that we would continuously be able to bring data to the UK post-Brexit. So if that was ever on your mind as a question, I answered it already.
I think it's important to answer because it may be that if you have within your sub-project partners in the European Union, partners in the UK, that may well be something that the European Commission are keen to ask. So if you have questions for more in-depth information, drop an email to Simi or myself, and we'll see what we can do. For Daniel's question about one pages, is there a dedicated section to data protection? I think there probably should be. It's going to be something that they'll be very interested in. The the EC reviewers. I think it's worth having at least a paragraph in there that stating that you acknowledge your responsibilities and that you put these measures in place within the sub-project and with the partners within your sub-project to ensure that you are complying with all applicable law. And for example, attending this webinar may be part of that, to say you're also conscious about education and dissemination of information. So yeah, I think there probably could be. Well, there we go. Who's this? Somebody has added contents. That might be Manuel hiding somewhere in the list. I saw there was a question from Meredith as well. For contacting the right people on different topics, dual use, data protection, is there a place where these contacts are listed on the HPP website, or is it the HPP compliance email address? So that is another good question. It's interesting because our HPP ethics support page has all of our contact information on, but that's not listed thematically necessarily. For example, the ethics support pages are listed thematically. I don't think the dual use working group has their own email address yet. So what I would recommend is, for now, perhaps yes, you do email HPP compliance, and I can point you in the right direction, because I pick up that email. Well, we all do, but primarily me. I pick up that email address. For data protection, I would suggest you contact Simi. For ethics compliance, the hcp.compliance@dmu.ac.uk. And for dual use, I don't think there's a dedicated website email address yet. So yeah, HCP compliance would do that. But that's a good idea, Meredith. Perhaps it's something that we should do in the future. Any other questions? Maybe a couple of minutes, and then we'll close if not. Okay. Is the third country animal data I want to keep an eye on changes on behalf? So yeah, I understand that. It should be, Douglas. I don't think a lot of it is out of date by any stretch, but we perhaps just need to review it and make sure that we're keeping up with legislation. It isn't a static document, or it shouldn't be a static document because regulations change. We'll keep you informed if it changes, and you need to be aware of that. Would you know of any specific recommendations/literature reference addressing data protection issues for open source, open access resources? Off the top of my head, no, but do you know of any?
Not that I can think of right now. It's something that we can look into to perhaps point you into any literature that would be relevant for that purposes, especially for open sources. So we can definitely come back to you on that one.
Okay. There's actually no name next to that question. Who is it that asked the question about literature?
Francesca.
Was it Francesca?
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know why you're not showing up as your name, Francesca, but we'll get back to you on that and see what we can do.
Yeah.
So I'll write that down. Open source literature. Okay.
And just as I think it's probably Francesca who's put for the purposes of sharing what should be in the one pages, I think that's kindly illustrated what the contents of one pages should be. So if anyone is still doubting or not very clear about what should be in the one pages, I think there's a list that's been shared there that you can always look up.
Yeah. Okay.
Mm.
So, okay, good. Well, I don't know. Maybe it's a technical issue on our end. Then it must be. They're invisible to us, Francesca. We can see the text, but not your name. Okay. Do we have any further questions? Nothing in Emma Harris from Orion.
Oh.
It's my former, my predecessor.
That's interesting. So yeah, I think it will be worth clicking on that link to get more information that has been kindly shared. Thank you very much.
Oh, it is Manuel. Okay, that's great. Okay. Unless we have any further questions, then we'll close there. As always, feel free to drop us an email, and we'll see what we can do. I know that the one pages are in development over December and January, and Manuel, we're in the same group as Manuel, so we're in contact with him a lot. But if you want to email us directly, then absolutely feel free. I'll type our various email addresses into here. So acp.compliance@dmu.uk. That's the general compliance one. Mine is .ac.uk. That's mine, and then it's your Simi.
Simi.Akintoye.
Yeah. At dmu.ac.uk.
The subsection, I don't know what that one is.
Yeah, that's why I put yours. I can never remember exactly what it is. Okay, thank you everyone. That was great. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Take care. Bye.